Hey, what's up, people? Welcome to our live stream. Today, we're going to be talking about is the rule of thirds a bunch of crap? And if you would like to learn how to turn your artistic weakness into your strength, check out artprof.org, where we have lots of free resources, tutorials, critiques, pro development, and all that good stuff. So, Clara, why don't you get us started on the conversation for the day?
Well, let's start with a definition for the rule of thirds. And I confess, I don't know much about the rule of thirds. I don't know anything about it, really. I sort of knew, but I've never used it myself, and nobody ever taught it to me. So I guess I'm the one here with the least amount of knowledge and experience. But it basically boils down to two things. You take an artwork, you divide it up into 9 equal parts, and then you place the subject of the artwork where the lines intersect. Would you say that's about it, Lauryn, or is there more?
I think that's close enough. I also really like that we're doing a stream on how the rule of thirds is a load of crap and you haven't used it. I think
I don't need it.
that starts a great conversation here. Anyway, get ready for a spicy argument because Jordan and I have used it and Clara hasn't.
And so, one thing for a lot of people is that it does provide some structure for how to think about composition, because I do think composition is very tricky. There's no formula for how to go about doing composition. And Jordan, I know that you used it, what, in college? You did this piece?
Yeah, this is in college about 10 years ago. And when I was first learning about composition, that was one of the only things I knew to rely on because that's all I was taught. And so as you can see here, I tried to have my most important areas around those intersection points. So I have the character in the bottom left, and then on the top right, I have that statue monument thing that I never quite figured out what it was.
And did you find it helpful?
Yeah, well, for me, I think it's helpful sort of as a way just to start out because I think it can become tricky when you're given an assignment or you're doing a project that's like create this big thing and you don't know where to start. So rule of thirds helps you to find a way to point your viewer to a certain location on the page.
Wait, I've got a question, Jordan. Did
Mm-hmm.
you draw out the rule of thirds on your paper and then put stuff on, or was it like you kind of judged it by where you thought the rule of thirds might be after you drew it in?
I kind of judged it after, like I had a way of just dividing it in my head, and
Yeah.
I'll be like, I think this is good. Because so one thing I don't like doing if I am using the rule of thirds is putting it exactly at the point of the intersection because it's just like why there's plenty of space, like just a little to the left, a little to the right. Like I don't think it's so much about the intersection point specifically, but just having it in that zone. I think is what's more important.
Cool.
Tell us in the chat who here uses the rule of thirds, who has never touched it, like me, who maybe used it but doesn't use it anymore, because sometimes these things they come in and out of our lives, and it's always interesting to see what we hold on to and what we stop using after a little while. And so this is the basic premise, is that it can be positive for some people in terms of being training wheels, because Lauryn, composition is really hard to teach.
It is, and there are a lot of different, I'll call them sub formulas for putting together a good composition. The rule of thirds is just one of them. And I have to say that when you're putting together a complex piece, kind of like Jordan said, you will have the rule of thirds is just going to come up on its own sometimes in some subsection of your painting or whatever it is you're putting together. I feel like it's not like you want to avoid the rule of thirds. It's just knowing that it's not the be all end all.
But here's the thing. I do think any rule like this, it can potentially become a crutch. And one thing I noticed when I was looking up the rule of thirds is that it's very prominent in photography, even more so, I think, than in painting and other media. And I don't think about myself as a photographer, but I do shoot a lot of photographs, and I don't think about it ever. So, Jordan, do you think this is a problem? Is this hurting me as an artist? This is
Uh,
my photo.
is it hurting you? I don't know if it's hurting necessarily. I think it's just a piece of knowledge that is good to know. And if you can find a way to create really amazing stuff without it, then more power to you. But again, like we talked about, composition is one of those really tricky, almost elusive things to get a hold on. And so I think it can be very helpful for a beginning student, or if you just can't think of any options, like where's a base place you can start, let's make it interesting by having things out of the center and, filling up the
See,
page.
Lauren, I don't need it. I'm fine. I didn't use it.
I think so. The reason why the rule of thirds is so popular is because it just looks good a lot of the times. It looks right. So, Clara, I would argue that you're using it anyways. Your brain is automatically doing it. You're just not calling it the rule of thirds.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah.
I'm subconsciously using it all the time. Well, I disagree. It is not part of my life, the rule of thirds.
Okay, keep telling yourself that.
Well, Jordan, day to day, how much are you using the rule of thirds? Is it something that's more of a past experience for you, or do you directly use it a lot?
I'll use it a lot. Like if I'm doing a thumbnail, like let's say I'm doing like a shadow boxers thing, and I'm doing something that's meant to be more of an illustration, then I will automatically revert to rule of thirds as a first stitch effort, and then over time, if I find something is more interesting by using a different angle or a different composition, then I'll switch it up. But it's always like the first idea I have, pretty much, because it's been ingrained in me, and I don't want to just settle for the completely centered composition, because that's what I would revert to naturally if I didn't think of the rule of thirds.
Lisa says the thirds keeps me from centering every piece. Well, I could get on board for that, getting people out of the center, Lauren.
That would be a good crit clash argument type thing, is which is worse, a centered composition or a rule of thirds? I think I think there are also reasons for a centered composition, but
there are.
I do definitely like that idea of using rule of thirds to get you out of the center if you don't want to be there.
Well, Jane says, I use it more often than not, but allow myself to break the quote rules if that's where my gut leads me on a piece. Yeah, I don't think there's anything that you should just be 100%. I cannot deviate from anything. And I do think probably a lot of people use it as a starting point and then maybe push it somewhere else. Do you think, Jordan?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's what I use it for. And again, there are plenty of scenarios where I would use a centered composition, but it just depends on what I'm trying to say. And I don't believe in just having hard, fast rules for everything. But again, it can be a very good place to go if you're stuck.
Lisa says it's too easy to place your horizon smack in the middle of the page. Rule of thirds helps me remember to push the horizon up or down. Okay, so maybe it helps you become more conscious of placement, even if you're not using it. Do you think, Lauren?
Yeah, I think landscapes are especially an area where rule of thirds comes into play, because I agree it is really easy to put that horizon right in the middle. That's how we usually see the horizon. It's right in the middle. So at the same time, I think viewers, your audience is most looking for the rule of thirds in landscapes. It's because that horizon line is so severe. So that is something to consider.
By the way, if you were taught the rule of thirds, let's say in a classroom or you write an article, tell us where, because I was never taught that. And I'm sort of like, this is weird that in all my years as a student, I never came across this. And yet online it's extremely prominent. So it's funny to see where things get taught or where they're not taught. This is my big beef. People start to rely on it. And then you're working in this very enclosed space of the rule of thirds, and you're not taking big leaps in terms of composition. Do you think that happens, Jordan?
Yeah, I think the rule of thirds is treated as the ABCs. And when people learn that first thing, they tend to rely on it all the time and don't want to experiment. So when you're just stuck like that, I think it can really become a bad thing. And if I were to look at 10 pieces and all of them have the exact same composition, it just gets boring after a while. And so we would encourage against that.
I mean, I just am not a fan of any pattern, template, rule for visual. I know people want somewhere to start, but don't we want to just meander aimlessly and work through it, Lauryn?
No.
Why not? It's curiosity. I read an article in the New York Times about how people don't have curiosity anymore because of algorithms.
Okay. Well, I think that it's important to know the, I'm going to call it syntax or grammar or something of composition, so then they can know how to put pieces together. I was just thinking about what my rule of thirds was, because I don't use the rule of thirds specifically. It comes up in little areas. And I realized that I use diagonals, like the diamond, because I loosely grid my canvases to have the diagonals in them. So I'm relying on a crutch all the time too. You haven't beat me up for it yet.
Well, I think you're accusing me of not having good grammar. My grammar's just fine. I've lived just fine without it. It's like everybody's like, oh, you need to have the thing. And I'm like, I'm fine. Nothing's going on.
Clara, I've noticed that we have not gotten to break down any of your drawings up here with the rule of thirds. How about that?
Okay, well, there's no slide, so too bad. We can't do it.
Another time in the Discord after.
Exactly. Well, here's a comment from Yuri Knows Social Life, who says most rules are there to help people start, but I think it's good to figure out your own way of doing things. Well, Jordan, do you have any advice? Let's say somebody uses the rule of thirds a lot to get started. How do you get out of that? Because I think sometimes we study something for a long time, it almost becomes a routine, and that experimentation is very important.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of my favorite things to do actually is studying compositions of film. If you look at certain cinematographers or certain movies or shows like Breaking Bad or any Marvel movie, they always push things a little bit extra. One of the other things I also think is really good is when you can, if you're going to use the rule of thirds, I wouldn't recommend using just a square because that tends to really be limiting. So if you stretch things out, like as if you're doing a widescreen format painting or drawing a photo or whatever, that can also help exaggerate things a little bit more, and it gives you more freedom.
Well, Crispy says, I feel the rule of thirds is a good tool, but in some ways a one-trick pony. If I were to have a portfolio of nothing but landscape work using the rule of thirds, it would feel repetitive and scale. Well, Lauryn, do you feel like you can notice when you're like, oh, rule of thirds again? Do you see that?
I think so sometimes. I think actually going off of what Jordan just said about looking at cinematography, one thing to think about when you're putting together your piece is what the vibe is going to be. What do you want your viewer to feel when looking at the piece? Because rule of thirds is a very stable vibe for a composition. Everything feels really in its place because rule of thirds feels so right to our eyes for whatever reason. So maybe that is grading against your subject matter that you want. Maybe you need to mix it up and have a rotational composition, or I don't know, all the different types of compositions that we looked at on that sheet of paper that Jordan posted beforehand.
Which we'll see later. Okay, you guys can't argue with me on this, though. You can't, although I'm sure you'll try. The problem with the rule of thirds is just visual. It doesn't take under account what is the intent of the artwork, because all artworks have something that they're striving to talk about. And so these are these beautiful photographs by, I don't know how to pronounce this name. Maybe some people can help me. Eugene, I don't know. I'm not even going to try. Somebody from France, help me out. But these were all about documenting those old 19th century neighborhoods in France. And so this is really a lens into a specific time period. So yeah, we can put the rule of thirds on it, but the rule of thirds doesn't help me in terms of subjects. What do you think, Jordan?
Well, I mean, they're kind of lined up on the two lines. For one thing, the other thing too is if it's, first off, we kind of said before, it depends on the context, right? If I'm going to draw a throne room, for example, it might help me to have that be a center composition. And even though we tend to discourage against that, that's a scenario where I could use it and it could be very effective. And so I think there's, I think it can only benefit you to, try these things and experiment. And if it doesn't work for that specific scenario, then you don't have to use it. I just don't think that you have to feel stuck with that.
At Jay, thank you very much. I think I'm just going to do that from now on. I'll just ask the audience to tell me.
Ajay.
Okay. Anyway, but see, you look at this, okay? The rule of thirds doesn't understand the hierarchy of the story because, granted, this is a group of people and they all play different roles. Rule of thirds doesn't care. It just cares about, oh, this dude is standing there. Right, Lauryn?
Well, also your rule of third lines aren't quite right here, Clementine says. If they were exactly even, they'd line up just right.
Do you guys think that I have a graphics team? Like I've got this whole marketing area to create graphics. Oh my gosh. Can't make anybody happy.
This is just my job tonight.
Thanks. I mean, that's pretty much your job all the time.
I know.
Well, this is how I see it when it comes to doing composition. You almost have three options. You can either put something on the edge, your focal point on the edge of the piece, which no one really wants to do. You can put smack dab in the middle, or you can put somewhere in between. And the somewhere in between is kind of where the rule of thirds comes in, because it's not the center, it's not the edge, it's somewhere else.
What we should have on the stream is that Velasquez painting,
Los
Meninos, to see if that follows rule of thirds, because that is the ultimate compositional feat.
Well, I think this is an extraordinary composition. I mean, Maurice Sendak really, I couldn't believe when I looked him up. I was like, oh my gosh, this book was made in 1963. Like I sort of had trouble processing that because his work is so timeless. But I don't know. I'm just looking at all these slides. And honestly, all I'm thinking is, who cares? I just want to look at the piece. Like, I don't care about the rule of thirds.
For this one, I don't even see this broken up by the rule of thirds. I see it being a diptych where there is a group on the left mirroring a group on the right, and then you have that empty middle there. I wouldn't use it at all.
Well, we have George here who's saying, I've seen it suggested that the rule of composition came from viewers trying to explain why they liked a particular piece. Well, composition is just so mysterious. Lauryn, why do you think that is?
Why is composition mysterious?
Yeah, why is it so frustrating? Because people are always asking me, how do I learn it? And they want something really concrete, and I just can't give it to them.
I think sometimes it can be a little bit plastic or contextual, and also I'm sure that there's some scientific postulation as to why we like things at certain ratios from each other, but that's kind of hard to grapple with when you're sitting down doing a drawing. Most people don't do math or geometry when they draw.
Lorelei says, I always thought the rule of thirds was just for photography. My photo teacher was super big on it. We were graded on it, but my art teacher never brought it up. Yeah, me too. It just never came up.
Well, it's funny because I actually think photography and I guess painting, drawing, illustration, they overlap each other, which is, I think, part of the reason why in art school they encourage you to take other majors, because if you don't, then you might actually miss a very vital piece of information. Like, I've never taken a photography class, but I'm sure that I could learn a ton from doing that, or at least, understanding the basics of what a photographer has to go through to create their work.
Okay, here's my other problem. I have many problems. It's just, don't need it. That's what I'm thinking.
New Clara.
It only works for rectangular shapes. So if you want to really take a leap and do something different compositionally, like these pieces, I mean, it just isn't applicable. And so that's where, to me, is so limiting, because I think if you stick with the rule of thirds, you're not going to think about doing composition like this, right, Lauryn?
I mean, you could not rule of thirds this in its entirety, but you could do portions of it. There are bits and pieces, little mini worlds where you could apply this. This is like, you're not going around every day of your life looking at things saying, this isn't right, I need a rule of thirds it. The rule of thirds. Like, that's not how life works.
My gosh, that's a pretty exaggerated example to provide. It's not very practical.
Well, this is the way I think of it. You know how there's always these charts about what the standard of beauty is, and they'll do all these mathematical proportions of someone's face. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like that to me. It's like, yeah, this is the ideal face. This is the most beautiful person in the world based on math. It's like, maybe according to math, but there's also plenty of variations. Like, we all three of us look very, very different from each other. And there's, it's just how it is. That's just how life is. And so I think it's good to appreciate and understand, but then when it comes time to deviate from that, then it's totally fine.
I think also when things are too perfect as far as those face proportions tests goes, if it's too perfect, it makes people feel uncomfortable, because then it doesn't feel real. People really, really need to have something throwing it off. And so rule of thirds can follow under that too. Some people know that something is wrong when it adheres too close to one of those formulas, because then it doesn't feel like a human did it.
Rebecca says, I was taught the grid as the 9-zone grid and the rule of thirds as separate ideas. The grid was more about establishing focal points, the other just to not split things in half. Oh, I'm hearing that, because I'm sure, depending on who's talking about it, there must be variations to how people think about the rule of thirds. So actually, if people have examples of variations on composition, or even other compositional options, because we'll show some of those later. But you know what? So many compositions don't use the rule of thirds. This is my next point. See, I am fine without it, Jordan.
Okay, have fun.
I want to know then what compositional elements or ratios are a part of this, because it's not like you're just in chaos mode. We can still clearly understand this piece.
My whole thing with composition, I think the thing I rely the most on is diagonals. And you can see it in the two figures, because she's above, he's below, and we have a nice little diagonal between the two of them. That's probably the thing I do the most. I just can't think about ratios. Like, the second someone says ratios, I'm like, no, I don't know.
I can see a star in this piece. There's a star made out of the diagonals.
Is there? I don't know.
I can see letter C.
Here's another point. And Jordan, you noted this to me, and it didn't even occur to me that negative space usually isn't considered in the rule of thirds. Why is that?
Well, I think when we think of the rule of thirds, typically we're taught, hey, this is the focal point needs to be in one of these 4 intersections. But because we don't really experiment, sometimes we forget that negative space can be just as powerful as positive space in an image. So there's areas where, like here, you could have maybe the background showing something, or you could just have an area of white. Here, this is actually very centered composition, but the character is just going at a diagonal angle. So he's surrounded basically by negative space. So in this situation, it really works well. And it's Spider-Man, so it automatically works for that reason.
Oh my gosh, Jordan.
You knew that was coming. I got 2 posters, 3 behind me.
Really? That's it? I'm so disappointed in you.
Well, the rest are my art books over here, and I got my Spidey mask up there.
Well, I just also think, from what I've seen so far, it seems like the rule of thirds is very much about the subject. So, we got Spider-Man here. And so the rule of thirds is, okay, where's Spider-Man? But Lauryn, in this piece, Spider-Man actually isn't that important compared to the big hexagon in the back.
Yeah, the big hexagon is definitely eating Spider-Man.
So much.
Have you guys seen the movie? Do you guys know the context of this moment? Just
No, don't spoil it for me.
Yeah.
I'm very careful about spoilers.
Yes, I know you are. You're very protective.
Yeah, but I will say Lauryn's not too far off.
I mean, I think that negative space is really interesting because there are so many different situations where negative space is actually the subject itself, where space is the thing. It's not about we're trying to dwarf the subject or the audience or whatever it is. The space is really, really important, and you don't want to box that all up into thirds or whatever.
Exactly. Clementine says golden ratio is funny because people love placing it randomly across pieces a billion times as evidence that someone used it. That's what I feel like we're doing right now, is we have these paintings, we're putting the rule of thirds on it, and I just don't care.
This is the Barbara Streisand effect. The more we talk about it, the more about people not using it, the more it will be used. And everybody after this is going to say, rule of thirds, rule of thirds.
No.
That piece is rule of thirds.
We shouldn't have done the stream. We should get rid of it so nobody knows.
No.
And Oofsie says, I feel like as an artist, we say we're going to apply certain techniques, but I always go back to what's comfortable. Well, that's not always a bad thing, Jordan.
It's not, you know, I think it's just about how you can mix things up with that comfort. So, for example, there's something in storytelling called the 3-act structure. You know, you have act 1, act 2, and act 3, and there's certain elements that coincide with that. As those of you writers, you know what I'm talking about. Most movies, at least Western movies, have that, but movies can still be very different. Like Harry Potter is very different than The Matrix or Jurassic Park or whatever. So in that setting or that technique, there's still freedom. And I think it just depends on you as an artist to decide how much freedom you want to give yourself.
All right. I like this part of the stream. Alternatives to the rule of thirds. There are many, but we're going to just point out 3 that we think are especially helpful. So Jordan, what are we looking at here?
So this is a sheet from an artist named Edgar Paynes, an old American painter. And what he did was he created a chart of just different ways to think of composition. So you can have things based off letters like the letter S or the letter L. You can have a big circle. Maybe it's the sun, maybe it's a lake, or, you know, there's one at the top left where it's the steelyard, where you have one big thing and one small thing, and just mixing that up in various scenarios to really kind of break away from the rule of thirds. And having it be so stagnant feeling.
Do you like this, Lauryn?
Yes.
It's so much better than the rule of thirds. Come on, this is way more fun.
I mean, this is kind of the pan calling the kettle black or whatever it is, or this is just jumping into a whole bunch of other formulas here, but there's that Capricorn part of me that loves it all laid out like this. I love a good formula.
Scarf and Tea has it printed out by their desk. See, this I can get on board with because of the diversity. This whole like stupid grid crap that we put, like, it's just so boring. Like, isn't this way more fun, everybody? Who here thinks, like me, this is way better than the rule of thirds? Because this I can do. And by the way,
it should be on there. It should just be on there as one of them instead of us prioritizing when we could do this entire stream for
the
S curve. We could say why the S curve is not all what's cracked up to be, and then be like, hey, look, why don't you check out the rule of thirds? Just rule of the day here. Don't mind the thirds. Don't stick to one formula. That's all.
But why is the rule of thirds the one that, like, nobody talks about? There aren't 50 YouTube videos about the S curve or what is it, radiating line? Like, why is the rule of thirds? Like,
if I were to guess, I think it's just because it's the lowest common denominator, honestly. Like that's why I say it's the ABCs of composition, because it's the first thing people go to. But then the challenge or the problem is that that's all people rely on after that, and they don't know any other solution. And then when you get an image like what we just showed with the charts, with the chart, it's like, oh, I can do an S. Oh, I can do the letter L. Oh, I can do a cross shape. You know, so I think it just opens up the door and for a lot of different stuff there.
And Jordan, the charts in this book, right?
Yes, the composition of outdoor painting. I have it right here. I think I got it on Amazon or something, but I honestly don't remember because it's been years. But it's
you said it was boring though.
Yes, it is a bit of a boring read. I never quite finished it, but they do have the charts in here, and I can just look at pretty pictures, so it's great.
I would get one just for the charts. I would just those make me feel very calm inside.
I'm glad you enjoy it.
How can you not like that chart? It's so cute. So here's my thing. I am such a fan of diagonals. They work every time. You can't put it on a diagonal and have it totally be a car crash. You can't put it in a diagonal and have things be boring. Like they're just super dynamic and they're very simple and straightforward. Do you like diagonals, Lauryn?
I love diagonals. I use them a lot. I have the same picture in one of my composition tutorials that I show to my students. Slide decks, that's the word I wanted to use. I've used the same one for diagonals.
Lorelei says, what do you think of viewfinders with the rule of thirds on them? Jordan?
I don't really have a preference. At this point, I can tell when the rule of thirds is working in an image. I think it depends on where you are on your craft. If it's something that you're just beginning to learn about composition with and you need to almost rely on it, then sure, why not? But I think at some point you will have to break those training wheels off and try and experiment with something else. My concern is I just don't want you guys to rely on it so much that that's all you do. If I look at 30 of your paintings and all 30 of them have the rule of thirds exactly as stated.
Good point from Chad, who says, don't most of these still basically stick to the 1/3 though? They just also incorporate other contrasts. I just conceptually like this better. It's cute, it's more diverse, and it's a lot more playful than this dumb grid. Sorry, you guys, I'm so not on board. Here's another thing though. Shapes of varying sizes. I feel like this is, again, a simple thing, but it's like, wow, you can accomplish a lot. Like, why are the sizes of the shapes here, Lauryn, really helpful for the composition?
It shows depth, especially because a lot of the color is very similar. So you have a tiny ship and then you have only the top of a very big ship. It must be a huge distance that she's looking out over.
And Jordan, it's funny, this seems like a really simple thing. Oh yeah, make them different sizes, but people oftentimes do not. And so much of the time I look at compositions and all the shapes are about the same size.
Yeah. When it comes to doing a composition, I think what we enjoy most is contrast. You know, that's why I think we like the diagonals, because typically, like on the piece you showed, Clara, that you did for Moulin Rouge, it was a square or rectangular piece, and you had a bunch of diagonals just cutting straight through it. And automatically that creates interest. So big shapes and little shapes, we see those two things side by side, and it automatically shows a story. You know, it's like Big Brother versus Little Brother, or Papa Bear and Kid Cub, whatever. You know what I mean? So there's just a lot of variations you can do.
I think this one is very important, and this one does consider subject matter and narrative. So, Lauryn, what do we mean by a focal point in a composition?
That's where your eyes want to go to. So here the focal point is, I think, the very, very bright sun. Oh, cool. I'm right. Oh, I didn't see that. This
Captain America.
Okay, I have not watched this. I don't watch superhero movies unless Sam drags me to them. But so this makes me think too. The first character I saw here was not that tiny little guy, because they're on the right, because there are other contrasts around here, and this image is so small, and maybe I need glasses. But I did see this one on the left, this silhouetted figure against that light. So that I felt like was the most important thing. Who cares about the one on the right?
That's Thanos.
Okay.
Well, I'm just often surprised that sometimes I'll talk to people about compositions and I'll say, where's your focal point? And a lot of people say, oh, I don't really know. And so it seems, again, like shapes, oh, easy. It is sort of easy when you remember, but Jordan, so often we forget.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the whole point of looking at an image is to look at something. Like you want to be able to tell a story. You want the viewer to focus on something. The way I see it is like if I'm going to spend 20 hours on something, I want them to spend time looking at a certain focus, whether it's a character, it could be a tree, it could be a stick, but there needs to be something that you're focusing on. And this image in particular, you have everything pointing up to Thanos's gauntlet. And it's just a big pyramid shape, essentially.
Clementine says, I guess you could say that you just need order behind them. If you can draw a recognizable shape connecting elements together, it's better than placing randomly. People just default to rule of thirds. Well, the key word you're using, Clementine, which I'm very happy about, is connecting. Because ultimately, every composition, you have all these pieces, and then what is their relationship? And Lauryn, that again, is sort of not so concrete. How do they connect and why?
You have to make that up. You have to make up those relationships, and then you do that visually using all of these little tricks that we've just talked about here, and not just rule of thirds.
This stream, we get more into the specifics of things you can do to create incredible 2D compositions. Well, we don't guarantee that, but you can try. Right after this stream, we are doing a Discord chat. It'll be me and Lauryn hanging out in post live stream. So I hope you can hang out with us there. You can sponsor a video. We were so excited that somebody sponsored the Reed sculpture video recently. And that is a video which would not have happened if somebody in our community had not stepped forward to help us fund that video. So thank you to our sponsors who have made so many videos possible for us. There's more information on artprof.org. We've got services, artist calls, personal art curriculums, artist statement editing, portfolio critiques. Join our Patreon group. It's a 24/7 art party, and we're very excited about it. And we've also got our wonderful top Patreon supporters who are holding up all the Band-Aids that we use to keep things together here as much as we can. Check out artprof.org. There's tons of content on there that's not on YouTube. The best way to use it is the search bar. ArtProf is a podcast. It's available on Spotify and also on iTunes. And subscribe to our channel for more tutorials, critiques, and business tips. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.